Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shabnam from SEAS, and I will be your MC for today. Welcome to the 8th edition of the SEAS Expert Series, and today's topic is on green procurement and closing the loop. We thank you for your support and hope that you will find the discussions today useful. Just some housekeeping before we begin the session. We will start with the presentations and answer questions at the end of the session. All your mics will be kept on mute, so please use the chat box and share with us your questions, if any, and we will answer them at the end of the session. Else, you may also use the raise hand function and our moderator will unmute you to ask the questions. I would now like to invite SEA's Executive Director, Ms. Kavita Gandhi, to say a few words. Kavita, please.
Thank you very much, Shab. And I am delighted to welcome all of you today to our Expert Series webinar. Once again, this is our 8th edition on the topic of green procurement. As you all know, this is a very important and topic that everybody is very interested in. This is a topic that we covered quite extensively also in our white paper that we just launched last year. We called it Accelerating the Decarbonization of Singapore Economy. And Peter Godfrey, who's on our panel today, was a contributor to that chapter, and he participated very actively in our white paper as well. So thank you for that, Peter. And I'd also like to say that these webinars are an effort by SEAS to stay connected to and keep our members as well as our community at large engaged during this difficult period. So thus, I'm very, very happy today to present to you our honorable panel for this afternoon. So we have with us Peter Godfrey, who's the Managing Director of Asia Pacific for the Energy Institute. That's another organization that we work closely with. We have a MOU with the Energy Institute, and Peter has been a great friend for SEAS all these years. We also have with us today Mr. Manuel Ungerer, who's the Head of Site Development for Novartis. Thank you, Manuel, for joining us today. And we are also very happy to have with us Mr. Gary Zhao from Shanghai. He is the Business Development Director for BRE in China. So you won't only just hear from Peter, who is an expert on this subject matter, but you will also hear from both Manuel and Gary, who are practicing green procurement in their companies and will share with you what their policies are and how they implement it. So a big welcome to our panel, and I'm sure our participants are as eager to hear from you as I am. And with that, I'll hand it over to Peter, who is going to moderate the discussions today. So over to you, Peter, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Kavita. To begin the session, please welcome Peter Godfrey, Managing Director, Asia Pacific at the Energy Institute, to share about green sustainable procurement. Peter, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Kavita, for that great introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good day all from people that are joining from other parts of the world. Let me firstly start off by saying that obviously the green procurement, sustainable procurement subject, as Kavita says, I think is a piece of subject matter that is going to become of far greater importance over the next 5 to 10 years than we have seen in the past. But let me talk a little bit about Singapore to start with. Singapore is highly dependent on others for its basic needs, for water, food, energy, and this dependence, together with associated risks, lies at the heart of domestic political narrative today. And of course, you know, we're up for another election soon, so I'm sure this conversation will be playing hard into this. Now, climate, but now also COVID-19, has raised this whole subject of resilience as being much more complex than we have seen in the past. So again, we can't really talk about just green from a climate change perspective, but we need to think about what a resilient future is going to look like within the context of where we're going to look at sustainable procurement. Singapore has already laid out ambitious plans to produce more of its food locally, to deal with water security, to build a more circular economy. It's also important to recognize that Singapore is one of the first countries in the region to really recognize the whole issue of decarbonization by the introduction of a carbon tax. But the point that green procurement must start with is the point to recognize this isn't not just about an energy efficiency game. This is about a resource efficiency game. It's about how we use our resources more effectively and find a way to recognize that the global supply chains that we have built during the last industrial revolution in the last century are actually in need of fundamental structural change in order to achieve that kind of procurement for the future that is more resource efficient. So yes, we are here in Singapore successful with dealing with waste and product recycling. We burn most of our waste right now, but it's only now that we're beginning to recognize that this is a question not only about waste to energy, it's a question of waste to value and making use of our resources more effectively as we go forwards. Next slide, please. So as Kavita mentioned, and please scan this, I won't go through this. I was honored to be asked to write the chapter on green procurement. Do scan this. This was a paper that was written last year for SU, and it's worth a read. It talks a lot about not only green procurement, but some of the other issues related to green technologies generally. And it's a really good read. So please have a read of that. Next slide, please. So I'm an energy guy, but I'm not going to start talking about energy. I'm actually going to start talking about food. And I'm going to talk about food because I think that's where this story begins. The world's population is growing in size and wealth and shifting towards a more urban areas, driving demand for food, clothing, everything that we consume. But today, more than 800 million people in the world are hungry. 2 billion people are suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. 2 billion people are overweight or obese. But these groups are not necessarily distinct. Not all malnutrition is the result of food insufficiency. It's actually, from a global perspective, we grow enough food. It's just that we waste so much, not only in terms of the consumption side, but in terms of actually the upstream side too. Something in the order of about 30% of the food that we actually produce agriculturally goes nowhere. It goes into the bin well before it gets to the consumer. And just talking about energy, I often use this as a good example. If we look at the hydrocarbons molecules that we have in the ground and the hydrocarbon molecules that we extract, coal, gas, oil, less than 20% of those molecules actually ends up as useful end-use energy. So we are paying today for a supply chain that actually uses 80% of our molecules of hydrocarbon to get to 20% molecules at the end-use consumer. That's not terribly efficient, right? So the concept here is very much around resource efficiency and how we might try and improve that. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at where the world is going, we begin to start saying, what does this actually mean for the future? And I'm not a trendy left-winger or socialist. I'm not an anti-capitalist. But what I am basically saying is that capitalism and the way the capitalist model of today is built fundamentally needs to change. We need to begin to start looking at a way where effectively capitalism is reinvented and takes much more account of the resource efficiency of the future, right? Next slide, please. What do I mean by that? We talk about ESG investing, environmental, social, governance. But what it really means is, in the past, when we look at our bankers, when we look at our businesses, we all know what value is, we all know what financial value is, but do they actually take enough account of environmental values and social values? And by which I mean not just carbon issues, but issues relating to the whole environment, health in today's world, much more important now with COVID-19 and the resilience going forwards, and particularly social values and how we value those. So for example, let me give you an example that is not on the slide, where we look at digitalization. Digitalization has great benefits, but it also has a potential cost on who gets employed in the future, right? So we need to find a way where cost, value, and pricing come back and become more in alignment with each other. And to do that, what we need to do is to create a much more integrated approach to the way we value things in the future. And that's what I mean by the capitalist model changing. I believe we are going to see a world where environmental and social values will take a much more increased role as we move forwards into the world of tomorrow. Next slide, please. So, as we talk about this and this concept of integrated value, as we talk about designing a world, creating a world, delivering a world, and sustaining a world that has created value, of course, behind all of this is waste. And the fact that at the end of the day, if we want to create a more efficient world, we have to avoid the use of waste by using our resources more effectively, but also find ways of actually reusing and recycling our waste, whether it's recyclability or whether it's turning it into some other type of value. That we all know as the circular economy, and that's basically where we are all going to move to. So my view, if you look at this triangle on that left-hand arrow, is as we move up that curve towards desirability, increasingly governments and businesses and consumers are all going to have to play their role in terms of creating that more desirable world for us. So environmental values, social values will not come for free. We will no longer just talk about carbon tax. We will talk about environmental tax. We will talk about social tax. And we build that into our pricing systems for the future. Next slide, please. So back to waste again, very quickly. You know, part of this, and this is a problem that now, of course, Singapore is beginning to look at quite a lot, is that waste and the value chain is not just about supplying and consuming and wasting. What we don't have built yet is the reverse cycle to that. What on this slide I refer to as the outbound logistics. We understand the inbound logistics, but we haven't yet started putting an economic model together that looks at the outbound logistics effectively. And to a certain extent, as I say, we begin to start seeing if you're trucking goods to a consumer, we should be able to use those same trucks to take goods away from the consumer. That's what the circular economy is all about. So we have to create these new ways of structuring the way we run our businesses and how they are integrated in the future. Next slide, please. So what are the underlying principles that go behind this concept of green and sustainable procurement? The first one is obviously material efficiency, resource efficiency, making sure that we refurbish, we reuse, we remanufacture as best we can. And every company that I know can do a better job than they're doing right now. There's plenty of scope to be able to do that. The second one is obviously around extending life cycles. And I'm sure Gary, when he speaks about built environment, will talk a lot about the fact that obviously buildings are about looking now at how we extend life, how we renew buildings, and how we create a more recyclable model for the built environment, for example. Obviously, energy plays a core role. Energy resources, minimizing consumption, making sure that we optimize consumption. Today, I just read a press article of a Swiss company, a Swiss apartment block that has just decided to build a data center in their car park. Now, why? Because the data center is actually producing heat, which will then actually pay for 70% of the heating bills for that Swiss apartment block in the future. Here's a true circular economy, an apartment block building a data center in order to provide heat for itself. So this is what I mean by the idea of reintegrating business and where we can actually go in the future. And to do that, we need to think about systems and the way businesses interact with each other in a very different way to the way that we've looked at it before. And then finally, back to food and biology. Most of the biological material streams that we have can be reutilized in one form or another, whether it's our human waste going back into agricultural fertilizer, or whether it's reutilizing water, as we're doing a lot of now in Singapore. There are various ways that we can actually use our biological cycle much more effectively around the world. Next slide, please. So, what does it mean for your organization? And here are some questions for you. Have you got a committee within your organization right now that is looking at supply chains, systems thinking, integrating different ways of doing your business? Have you got an organization that is truly aligning the staff and itself into these different directions? Have you got an organization that understands technology and what's possible? Have you got an organization that's speaking to your suppliers and your consumers about what's possible? Have you got a sourcing strategy that's looking at all of these things? So as you can see, there is a whole range of things that can be done by all of us. And this is not just about organizations, it's about us as human beings as well. We all have a role to play when it comes to looking at the subject of sustainable procurement going forwards. Next slide, please. So, what does it achieve? And I think where I'd like to sort of say, firstly, is by carrying out this method of looking at reducing, reusing, and recycling, this is not necessarily about green procurement, sustainable procurement being expensive. I think most people, including myself, that are in this world, that believe that the capitalistic model will have to change in this direction, will recognize this is actually where value for the future will lie. So this isn't all about, oh, this all costs a lot of money, we haven't got time to do it. I think this is opportunity and real value for the future. So as an ex-banker, I would say, this is what I really want to invest in the future. This is where the future will lie. And we all have a role to play, as I say right at the end of this slide, by trying to move ahead of the curve. That's where the true value will be. Next slide, please. So where do I leave this? I don't leave it with companies, I don't leave it with human beings, but I would like us all to think about these issues and think about them a lot more deeply. I come back to government. And government has to play a role. None of this is possible without the government playing a role and steering its society in this direction. And it is my view that governments around the world have not yet spent enough time developing a true sustainable procurement policy that requires environmental leadership. It requires people to stimulate innovation and governments to stimulate innovation, to support emerging technologies, and to create and do what they're actually saying. So have their own green and secure and sustainable procurement policies for themselves, and encourage their suppliers and products and services in government to practice green and more sustainable procurement themselves. The more they do that, the more they can persuade their others to do that. And then finally, of course, we can have a tax and spend system, a little like carbon tax. We, at the end of the day, will have to put in the encouragement processes that are necessary to make sure consumers and to make sure that the overall stakeholders within a supply chain are appropriately rewarded and punished if they don't fulfill the green and sustainable procurement policies for the future. So there I will leave it. There's more to talk about. There's an introduction. I'd now like to speak to a couple of our industries that I think are both actively engaged in this process, and hopefully they'll set some of the words that I've spoken as an introduction in the context of what they say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We would now like to invite Manuel Ungura, Head of Site Development at Novartis, who will be sharing his perspectives from a major pharmaceuticals company's perspective. Manuel, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Peter, Kavita, and the CIS team for inviting me to this very interesting forum and allowing me to share what Novartis is doing around the environmental aspect, and also to share on what we are doing in developing policies or procurement strategies on the topic. Yeah, so next please. So yeah, my name is Manu Lunge. I'm the head of the site development organization here in the manufacturing hub in Novartis, Singapore. And I would like to share with you today on what our environmental programs in Novartis as an organization, but also in Singapore are like. So we will talk a little bit on what our overall strategy looks like, what we are doing around the world, because obviously we are present all over the world, but also on how far have we gone here in Singapore, and how procurement with very specific policy measures are helping us to deliver those sustainability strategy in our company, right? So this here is an overview on what we are trying to achieve. So we have actually really strong ambition at Novartis to achieve substantial sustainability improvements in the years to come. So we would like to achieve carbon neutrality, really go strong on the circular economy, and go plastic neutral eventually, and really build a very, very sustainable water program in the company. And if I can take you to the 2025 targets, we definitely are on track, and will go into only use the renewable energies for our own operations, what is basically directly under our control, and start and continue building very strong environmental criteria in our purchasing contracts, purchasing agreements with our partnerships or suppliers. Yeah. Going into circular economy, certainly we're looking into reduction of plastics. Obviously, widely eliminate PVC in our packaging, secondary packaging mainly, but also trying to implement it in primary packaging, and drastically reduce our waste generation. So it's actually by 50% reduction in 2025. Equally, water consumption, I think, especially here in Singapore and in other countries with scare water availability, this is a big topic. So we're actually very, very active looking into how actually we can reduce water consumption in the manufacturing environment, which is a big challenge. But we have very strong ideas, and I will share a little bit afterwards. And of course, continue to sustain our zero impact on the effluents from our facilities. Next, please. So just a nice result what we have achieved elsewhere in the world. So actually in the US, we already have achieved carbon neutrality by creating clean energies from specific generation assets we owning in the country. So it's actually really building on renewables, building on partnership with other organizations to help us to actually actively reduce our carbon footprint in our network, which is again spread all over the world in the areas of research, development, but mainly also on our large manufacturing footprint. So this is just one example. We have quite a number out there. So it's really, really showing how we are moving at a corporate level really to go into sustainable and environmental friendly operating model. Next, please. So when we look specifically here in Singapore, so as mentioned, we are quite actively involved. And just to give you a context, in the pharmaceutical business, it is really controlled business. So obviously reliability, manufacturing reliability, and quality of manufacturing has to be a priority for us, because we need to continue delivering high quality and safe output of our drugs to our patients. However, around this, we're really trying our best to create environmental sustainability in our operations. So this is just a snapshot on how much is going on here. We have several initiatives running.
Whoops. We've lost him. Give it another couple of minutes. Shall we go on to Gary and maybe come back to Manuel?
Okay, sure. So we would now like to invite Gary Chow, Business Development Director at BRE China, to share his perspectives on the built environment and its future. Gary, please.
Thank you, Ash. Thanks, Peter. And also thanks for Manuel. Probably he's dropped off the line. And I'm happy to take over from here to share a bit of our thoughts representing BRE on the very specific topic of green procurement, because we do believe that for the built environment industry, quite different from the pharmaceutical and also from the energy industry, I think that from the perspective of a built environment, green procurement actually consists of a very important section down the food chain for the whole cluster of the practitioners to think about how does it impact the best exercise, the best practice out there, from architects, from engineers to contractors to operators and managers of assets and buildings. Next one, please. So before we jump into the standards and exercise, I do want to take a very short 30 seconds to share a brief overview of what does BRE actually do, because what we do is all about standardizing process and schemes across different countries in the world to try to unify a measurement, because a unified measurement, we believe, would provide a very, very strong tool when it comes to complex and complicated concepts like green procurement, like building sustainability, like built environment improvement and resiliency of it, etc. So BRE has been established for over 90 years, almost 100 years. So we do believe that the standards we set up since 1921, we have different types of standards for fire protection, for built environment testings, and for designs and the construction of the assets. Next one, please. So about the very specific topic of green procurement, I think it fits perfectly under the theme of sustainability, because the triple bottom line has been quite commonly known. And also I think procurement, whenever it comes to that, it's always heavily linked to the economic behaviors and also the impact to the environment and also the social effects. So I think it falls quite nicely on the triple bottom line, which consists of the topic of sustainability. Next one, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the international drivers behind green procurement. And I think it falls between the global schemes, which is somewhat we're trying to bring up some answers to, a globalized, unified measurement. And also, I think quite importantly, the local recognition of these global schemes, because whenever we try to land our scheme, our standards into a new country, there's always a barrier behind the local market and very successful practiced a global scheme. So it's all about the adaptability of the schemes. I think that types of fitting process falls nicely into the international drivers. And ultimately, I quite agree with what Peter just mentioned, that it's about government collaboration. It's about uniting different entities across different countries and regions to contribute together for the industry to move forward. Next one, please. I'm going to share a little bit of our international influence, because we do believe that it has to start from the top down methodology. So take BREEAM as one of the examples. BREEAM is actually the most widely used, even more projects than LEED and any other green building schemes. So with over 580,000 building projects certified under BREEAM, we do establish our standard to be adopted across different countries. We do have our coverage for over 90 different countries in the world and growing. Next one, please. And under BREEAM, I think one of the key value or core concept behind it is that the synergy across different specialties. For instance, if you take a look at life cycle assessment, it's actually quite fitting for the green procurement process, because whenever you look at materials, whenever you look at the stuff that you purchase, things that you use for your buildings, for your built environment, you always have to benchmark it very initially from the cradle to gate concept, because whenever a material is produced, it's landing on the project, and that's what we call the cradle to gate process. But as we move forward, it's also equally important, if not more importantly, is the concept of the gate to grave. Because if you look at the materials, what happens after it's being used, what happens after it's being applied to the projects, is somewhat overly neglected in many exercises. And we do provoke or encourage the concept of cradle to gate to grave. I think that's very important formula of the life cycle concept. And also I think it lies between the future driver of the market. How do you access and track all your materials even after it's being used? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the LCA concept behind it in the following slides. Next one, please. Before we jump into the details of LCA, I do like to address a little bit of the local recognition sector, because as mentioned before, how do you align a global standard locally with local authorities? I would like to highlight one of our very successful practices in China here, where I'm based. We did manage to pull off a local recognition program with China government authorities. We somewhat, by connecting the scheme of BREEAM and China 3-star, reaching a consensus where a lot of equivalent terms could be mutually agreed upon to narrow the gap for local projects to identify what should they do better in terms of providing improvement opportunities for the projects. I think the same rules apply for LCA, because on the right corner, we did manage to jointly announce another very important collaboration with Shanghai government, which is to establish a local material database for local manufacturers to be able to compare their products against not a very globalized database, which would be unfair, but also a localized, transparent database. It leverages the benefits for the manufacturers to be able to select their best performing materials to be highlighted, instead of revealing their weakness and drawbacks. That's something they would like to avoid. Next one, please. So in BREEAM, I think that echoes with my previous statement that actually a lot of local equivalents in China. I'm sure we will provide this in other countries as well in Asia, with localized standards. So in BREEAM, we actually recognize different terms in the China National Green Building Codes to be able to recognize in terms of the sustainable procurement terms. So I think that's one of the very important examples to share with the audience today. Next one, please. So we do want to highlight a little bit of our EPD exercise, which is also a very fantastic example of the green procurement, the environmental product declaration, because for EPD, it's always about data transparency. I think data transparency is the key phrase that I'm going to mention quite a few times in the following slides. So next one, please. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the EPD and LCA process, by EPD, the point is to provide an opportunity and a platform for manufacturers to effectively reveal the essence of the product and also the carbon footprint of the product by inputting the data into a platform and benchmark their product across the industry to position themselves So a process is to input the data and have a third-party verifier to benchmark it, and then the procurement team of projects would be able to select wisely based on the open data and the EPD being verified. Next one, please. So a quick oversight of the EPD system run by BRE, which is called BI Lina. So it's actually about putting data back in your hands. Next, please. There's a very tiny instruction showing the columns that how do you actually input the data into the system, and with certain methodology of calculation provides a very precise and concise conclusion for your manufactured products. Next one, please. So from the cradle to gate, it's actually a very minimum criteria for benchmarking it, but also, as mentioned before, we move this forward to the gate to grave methodology in the Lina system. Next one, please. So actually, the benefits from an LCA to EPD is it provides an open source for every practitioners in the food chain to be able to review and highlight and have their announcement being acknowledged widely across industry, especially by a standardized process. So it actually streamlines the effect and avoids the gap from manufacturers to procurements. So it actually freed them from the dilemma of all the mess of the manufacturers saying that how good and how green their product is, but not too trusted by the procurement team. So that's the benefit of the EPD system. Next one, please. So as one of the social responsibility for the corporates, actually EPD is very, very beneficial for them. It actually helps them shorten the gap, and with a traceable record for the product's environmental carbon footprint. Next one, please. So what does an EPD contain? It contains a very concise conclusion, as mentioned before, allowing the procurement team to make the selections very wisely. I'm not going to bump into the details of the EPD. Next one, please. So before we wrap it up, I would like to spend one last minute on the building level impact, because all it compiles together is to allow the project team from the design stage to operation stage make wise choices. If you calculate a building level life cycle assessment, you could see how important it is to take in the materials to consideration that allows the best decision for the project owners. Next one, please. Next one, please. It's actually a small animation system showing that if you combine all the materials together, that's the fundamental elements forming a building itself. So that's why they always address so much, but the industry has been seeing a deficiency into the procurement, especially the green procurement access. Next one, please. So the green procurement, the best factor of it is that it actually allows the project team to be able to explore changes, because if you can identify the gaps very early on, it helps architects, helps the engineers to identify the carbon footprint and also the after use of materials. So in an ideal world, architects can actually calculate the life cycle carbon emission of the building even before they are being built. So the data transparency in that is, I think, a very key element for it to be able to realize. Next one, please. So that summarizes my sharing with the audience today, from data transparency, from standardized process to local equivalent, and it all lands down on actual building projects to be able to benchmark itself on a very open database. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your presentation. I think Manuel is back on the webinar, so we will continue with his presentation slides.
Hi, Manuel. Yeah, let's go through them very quickly so we can get into the Q&A, yeah? Hello?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so sorry about the technical issue earlier, so I'll be very brief on going forward. So now just this is an overview on the initiatives happening or we have done in the past. So just quickly what really interesting ideas. So for example, sludge dewatering. So what we do, we actually remove the from our solid manufacturing, from our solid solids manufacturing, we remove the particles from the waste, and for that we can actually remove the waste, the solid waste from the wastewater, and the water can be recycled in our building cooling system, for example, or heat track optimization. I'll be probably aware that in the, pharmaceutical facilities, they're very high on airflow exchange rates. So the more we can optimize them, obviously to what regulatory requirements allow them, the more we can save on energy and so on. Looking at Singapore here, a huge demand on building cooling. We're talking about 12, 13 megawatt of chiller load installed. Obviously, running at high efficiency is critical to our operations to keep efficient, and that's what we achieve by doing this. Next, please. Obviously, with all these initiatives, energy efficiency, circular economies, obviously it's highly critical that also from a procurement perspective, we have strong programs in place that allows us to develop those initiatives further. So, and as such, our procurement organization is really evolving strongly around the concept and building in really strong requirements in our purchase requirements, and building strong partnerships in a network with strong companies we can work on this. So obviously a big concept is on purchase of energy. Renewable electricity is a big topic, having really high consumption in the field. So for there, really looking into building renewable electricity strategies in procurement, really looking in collaborative opportunities with other big players in the market, and together we have opportunity to procure renewable energies from the market, and also engage with those who control those markets, right? So actually we can really encourage to have access to renewable electricity all around our operation. And of course, having full transparency on how we deal with that. Of course, also transparent approach with our suppliers. So what we really try to engage with suppliers to build partnerships, actually to grow our suppliers to be part of this, to actually share our ideas and concepts with them, so they can also be built in and bring them on board in general with the concepts. Next, please. And as such, it's really going everywhere in the organization. So really looking into the big consuming areas. Is it warehousing, distribution, utilities, purchase of direct materials, but also the movement of our people around the world, business travels, and so on. So it's really we're building in the concept of sustainability everywhere, and is clearly the target, the requirement to have really clear targets in place, and make them measurable, that we can really drive them as we move forward, and really have all these initiatives really as mandatory built in our sourcing event. Yeah, and then, as I said, building collaborations, making sure that we stay adherent to our contracts, and to employ the strategies all over the network, providing tools and opportunities to our partners to be with us. So that's in a nutshell the program in Novartis, and how the whole operation is shaping around the concept of environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. We have come to the end of the presentation. Please do share in the chat box or raise your hands if you have any questions.
Yeah, I think I'm back online now, so everybody should be able to hear me. A number of questions, so we will go through them one by one, but I'd like to start off and go back to Gary's presentation, if I may, Gary. you raised the subject of standards, and it's a really interesting one because, of course, historically, the region has relied very heavily on US standards, UK standards, etc. And you raised this subject of how important actually coming up with common standards is to the whole concept of sustainable procurement, right? And here's China that, theoretically at least, when you read the papers, would say, oh, it's very difficult to get any communications going. But there you are sitting in Shanghai, succeeding to develop joint standards with China. Now, I'm interested to know what you think the appetite is to actually grow these standards, because on the one hand, we're seeing a world that is increasingly nationalistic or will be in the future. But on the other hand, we all recognize the need that if we're going to move forwards in terms of common practice, we need a common set of standards, and we should be developing more of those here than we have been, back in the West. So what's your view in terms of having dealt with this from a British and a Chinese perspective?
Sure. Excellent question. In fact, I think based on my experience dealing with both authorities and practitioners within the industry, they both quite commonly hold the opinions that standards are actually somewhat a tool to protect the local market. Now, if you look at standards that way, that serves as a barrier from external competitors to enter a market. But if you elevate it to a higher level, if you look at it at a global perspective, standardizing exercise is actually beneficial for everyone, because through standards, you can streamline the effect, you can reduce the communication barriers. So instead of holding the standards domestically, I think each government should try to open up their perceivings of their standards by trying to communicate across different standards. For instance, we've been dealing with China authorities from the government side a lot, and they quite agree that the standards in China needs improving, but how and towards what direction should they improve is actually showing a huge demand for communications across the different types of standard providers. So I think based on that, at least in China or in Shanghai market, what we witness is that it's actually opening up to embrace different standards and take a little bit of good standards in the US, take a little bit of the good standards in the UK, and merge each of them to formulate a local standard and to continuously improve that, to absorb different best practices. So I think that's actually not creating more barriers, but opening up to global competitors to try to streamline the effect and lower the entry cost. So I think if you look at standards that way, it's actually boosting the economy for each region and country to be able to benchmark themselves along with global practitioners. I think that's my take on that one.
And Manuel, from a pharmaceuticals industry's point of view, Novartis is obviously a large global enterprise. Here you are sitting in a plant here, there are massive plants in Europe, there are massive plants in different sorts of the world. Do you see standards or some of these issues around standards being barriers to your progress in terms of achieving sustainability and your connectivity with suppliers and producers in the future? And if so, is that an area you think ought to be improved upon as we move forwards?
Absolutely. I think what we see in general in our organization, we don't put boundaries to our associates to develop programs. So we are really in an unbossed organization, and we give in our organization the freedom for people to come up with ideas to really work on the concept of sustainability in general. And as such, there are really super ideas all over the world coming up. And with this, it's how we can implement them to get the best benefit out of them. And often we have the situation that because of the regulations we are in, or perhaps also the limitation I don't know, is it from a feasibility study point of view, it creates barriers which actually stops us from pursuing something which has a huge potential for the environment or for the sustainability itself.
Okay, great. I'd like to come to a couple of questions that one was asked by my good friend Victor Mills of the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce, and another one by Jessica Yom. And I'm just going to quote Jessica because I think it's a good intro. And then if you would, just put on my summary slides in a second. But let me just ask the question first. There are three big barriers to doing the smart thing and driving the much needed holistic change. One is politicization. The second one is greenwashing. And the third one is climate deniers, okay? How do we deal with these people, or how do we address those problems? Now, that plus the COVID-19 question within Victor Mills, I think introduces another couple of questions. So if you can show my first summary slide, that would be quite useful. And again, I've given you a little scanner so that you can scan this, but this was a model that was created by the World Economic Forum, and it recognizes that the world is changing and connectivity and how we relate to different ecosystems. You know, for example, in the energy world, increasingly, we're now looking at energy, water, waste as being part of the same issue, right? You know, energy is no longer a single issue subject. It affects a lot of things. These models have tried to create the beginnings of an ecosystem, you know, a different way of looking at how all of these combine in different ways, okay? So I guess my question now is around saying yes to standards. We both said that, you know, we need standards, but actually we need to create new standards because we're going to live in a world of new ecosystems, right? And we need to create the structure around those sort of areas to look at, okay, which I think are quite interesting. And I would say, to answer Jessica, that much of the way we will begin to get rid of the greenwashing, get rid of the politicization, is a recognition that actually business is structurally changing. The way we do business is fundamentally changing as a result of different ecosystem design, different technology. Now, let me ask Gary and you again, Manuel, from your point of view, when you look at your businesses and how they were run maybe 10 or 15 years ago, in Gary's case, of course, you know, BRE goes back to 100 years or whatever it might be. Obviously, the whole structure of your business has changed dramatically. How are you considering this? In other words, when you're communicating with your suppliers, you're not looking at traditional suppliers anymore. You're looking at creating standards around a new ecosystem. Gary first, and then over to Manuel.
Yeah, I think people's perceptions of sustainability or perceptions of green has changed quite drastically for the past decade. In the very early days, I remember, people were only talking about sustainability as energy efficient. Nowadays, we know that sustainability is far more than just energy efficient. It also contains, not to mention carbon, but it contains health and well-being for the end user buildings. So people are now struggling a lot across different factors under sustainability. For instance, if you want an indoor environment to be both energy efficient and also healthy for the end users, sometimes they could contradict with themselves. And the whole essence of balancing these factors out, I think, is now becoming a very heated topic for the industry, because on one hand, you have to design your HVAC system very, very appropriately. And also you have to allow your tenants in your building to be able to tweak the interior space a little bit to fit their requirement, to fit their data transparency requirement, to fit their educational requirement for their users to be aware of the nice little factors that they do to improve the built environment. So I do believe that the very concept is always evolving for sustainability. In future, I mean, post-pandemic of COVID-19, people now take resilience more seriously than ever. People are realizing that what's good old days are not guaranteed. They shouldn't take it for granted. They should learn to deal with emergency surprises that took them under guard. So I do believe in future the concept keeps growing and more opportunities would pop up for the industry, for the suppliers, for the manufacturers to catch up with the new trends.
Thanks, Gary. Manuel?
Yeah, it's a very, very valid point. We see in general what the tendency is going. We start working more with partners rather than with suppliers because we see in the value of partnerships also the common goal of delivering sustainability programs, right? And so it's also as part in what we said about our procurement programs, we actually start building in specific criteria in that direction, and we see that at the end it's creating connections with partners in the industry, which are really beneficial to us. What I just wanted to add as well is that it's complex in the industry like pharmaceuticals, because in a manufacturing environment, there's only as much as you can optimize from an energy or from a water consumption perspective, and so it's rather complicated. However, you know, it's a lot is going on, and we're trying to explore what's out there. And obviously also in the element of digitalization now, we're bringing smart technologies on board, which helps us really to keep full control of utilization and consumption. Helps a lot.
Thanks very much. And the next slide, please, and the final one, and then we'll maybe ask Kavita if she has any final wrap-up questions. But let me go back to Victor's question, which was more around COVID-19 and obviously how that will affect where we go. And of course, Gary mentioned the magic word resilience, you know, which every management consultant is now using as the basis for everything, right? So, you know, sustainability and resilience now has become, if you like, the two mother words that we must all live by. But I think I give you this slide because, you know, this is a McKinsey slide that was recently produced, really looking at some issues around saying that obviously when we look at this world that we're creating, this new world, clearly changing your portfolio of assets, looking at what you manage and how you manage them is important. How to acquire different capabilities that allow a different sort of integration to happen, which I think Gary mentioned to a certain extent, you know, also reskilling people within that context. And then, of course, this issue which McKinsey describes as betting on adjacencies, you know, looking at industries that maybe traditionally were not your industry in the past, but are adjacent enough to begin to start looking at basically bringing together in a more effective and a more efficient way. So positioning for resilience, I think, is around that. But coming directly to COVID-19, I'd like to make a quotation from a guy called Professor John Sturman, who heads up the faculty of the sustainability faculty, actually at MIT Sloan School of Management. And he basically said that there are 4 lessons that have come out of COVID-19, 4 very simple lessons, which I'd just like to quote. Lesson number 1 is out of sight doesn't mean you're out of danger, which I think is a very good one to remember. Lesson number 2, human behavior responds more to emotion than it does to science, which I think is also a very good point. Lesson number 3, stop thinking growth versus green. Green is growth of the future. And then his final point, which is really this whole conversation that we've just been having with regard to standards, and the fact that we all know we're going to be living in a slightly more protectionist world. His final lesson is to say, global action is still essential, and we can't live in tomorrow's world without a connected world. So I leave it on those 4 points. Kavita, any final questions or wrap-ups that you would like to make? I think that probably covers the session.
Right. I know we've run out of time, but I had a quick question. As you know, we have thousands of SMEs in Singapore, And we always struggle when we are promoting, all these areas, even energy efficiency, which sounds like a very easy one. So my question to the panelists is, how could we really encourage our SMEs to really adopt green procurement? That seems like a very challenging situation.
Gary, would you like to start with some ideas? I'll wrap it up. Any thoughts? Gary, are you still there? I think he's gone. I think we've lost Shanghai.
Looks
Okay.
like, yes.
Okay, so let me give you an idea. How do we encourage SMEs to get more involved in this process?
Mm-hmm.
I think we need, number one is we need to network these ideas and these concepts more fully. There's a need obviously for communication. Number two, I think at the end of the day, government has a role and must play a leadership role within this context. But I do think from an SME perspective, we should be encouraging, if what we hear from our government, which is all about creating future value, is true, and we're looking at resilience for the future, to my mind, what we have discussed this afternoon is not a nice to have. It is the way business will be done in the future. So we have no choice. We have to get people recognizing this is not greenwashing anymore. This is actually the way the world will be and the way the world will change. And as I said right in the beginning of my presentation, the way we will perceive value in the future. Because value will no longer be based on the values of today. They're going to be based on the values of tomorrow, right?
Sure.
Manuel, anything to add?
Well, Peter, you said it perfectly. Yeah. For me, it's just what I see. It's just stay curious, right? Stay curious and really learn from this changing environment. It's a really interesting time, and I think we are in this ambiguity phase of ambiguity where new things coming together. So it's about observing and learning the process, and we come up with amazing ideas, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, both Peter and Manuel. I think that's a very good note to end on, to keep our communication channels open, and that's what we do as an association. I think that's what our role is, and that's what the role of the other associations that we engage with, and institutes like Energy Institute as well, besides providing technical training and information and standards. I think a big role of associations is to communicate, and we hope that we could keep those channels of communications open and keep bringing experts and topics like this to our community, and move these conversations forward. And also at this point, I'd like to very much thank Peter Godfrey for working with us to bring this webinar to our audience, and of course to our two speakers, Manuel as well as Gary, for participating so enthusiastically. A big thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the insightful discussion. To our participants, we appreciate if you could take a minute to give your feedback in the short poll. Thank you very much, everyone. We have come to the end of the session. Thank you to all our speakers and participants for your time and support given to our expert series webinars thus far. Thank you, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you very much.